150 players signed up for my Marvel Snap tournament, and you will never believe what won. This tournament did have slightly different rules than a typical Marvel Snap tournament. You had to be playing a card from the last 5 months, and Sabanur and on, and the following 6 cards were banned: Captain Carter, Mercury, Gambit, Isca, Supergiant, and Arishem. I'll put an explainer as to why on the back end, but for now, let's get into the winner. The winner was Cerebro 5, which put in a dominant performance in the hands of Galgus, a KMBest Discord member, and if I'm not mistaken, maybe literally the first person to sign up for this tournament. Very early entrant. This is a deck that is notably powerful in a couple of different contexts. The first is that it plays the most straight-up good cards of any Cerebro deck. Getting to play cards like Juggernaut is just a real upgrade over other Cerebro decks that are messing around with things like Gorgon and Sentinel. You get real cards in this deck that do real things, and this deck recently received a big upgrade in the form of Nocturne, allowing it to have some inbuilt ability to actually interact with locations that previously was not particularly accessible to the deck. This is also a deck that has more early game than you might expect, thanks to Medusa, Mysterio, and Rhino all being 2 costs that have 5 power, and Rocket Raccoon potentially getting up to 5 power. To me, though, the cards that actually make this deck tick are Miss Marvel and the Ancient One, which provide you multiple ways to go extremely tall. The Ancient One at 3/5 is already a pretty on-rate body, and I think the fact that this deck runs as many 3/5s as it does is part of why it's as good as it is. But it also allows you to multiply ongoing effects like Cerebro's ongoing effect or Miss Marvel's ongoing effect. This means that unlike a lot of other Cerebro decks, you actually have game plans that can win games when you don't draw Cerebro. There's also a pretty decent use case for Namorita here, who is providing additional discounts in a world where a lot of your plays are pretty tight. But just baseline, you have a decent amount of ability to play a fairly respectable mid-range game plan. You'll notice there's a Cosmo in here, Cosmo Juggernaut, a very potent combo, but what this speaks to is not just that this is a deck that has a lot of power output, it also speaks to this being one of the few Cerebro decks that can meaningfully play for priority. Very often, the Cerebro game plan is built on playing from behind, the goal being to have a bunch of small guys that then become extremely large at the end of the game when you play several copies of Cerebro. Unlike other Cerebro decks, this one gets to play from ahead, and that is also a particularly powerful dynamic. In second place was SQR with Cerebro 4, and this is where we start talking about how the ban list really impacted the choices being made here, because what I'm seeing out of both of these choices is 2 players who saw that Captain Carter and Gambit, aka the most maximal combo deck and the most anti-your-stuff control deck in the entire game, were no longer going to be able to do the things that they do to you. Cerebro is, at a fundamental level, a deck that doesn't like seeing Gambit because a lot of Cerebro deck building is about creating multiple units that get the Cerebro buff. That means that it tends to be pretty cheap. So when you see a bunch of Gambits off of Mother Ascani, a lot of your power goes away, and that's to say nothing of the fact that Cerebro itself can get blown up. This is a big point in favor of Cerebro in a tournament like this. But the Captain Carter one is also particularly important here because typically the Cerebro decks like this struggle with the fact that Captain Carter can simply go taller than them. This is one of the few Cerebro decks that doesn't necessarily have to, thanks to inclusions like Shadow King, but it is still an overarching theme that Cerebro can simply get outpointed. The metagames in which Cerebro has historically been the best are the ones where it is dictating terms to its opponents. Very mid-range heavy metagames. And to be clear, you might not know it from talking about the winner in the second place, this actually was a very mid-range heavy metagame because that was the other effect that the ban of Gambit and Captain Carter had. Captain Carter is a deck that goes very over the top of mid-range decks, and Gambit tends to crush their scalers. Those decks not being here meant that there was a lot of mid-range, which was perfect for Cerebro to dominate. The other major story of the tournament, and this one perhaps not surprising at all, was Batrock the Leaper and his attendant package. That is to say, Batrock, Sam Wilson, Craven, Spider-Man Brand New Day, Hydra Stomper, and Silk. This is the list that Gamer took. I thought it was a very solid thing to do, although this is a little bit, in a complimentary way, I'll say it's KMBest deck building, which is to say it says, oh, well, I can't be doing the Gambit stuff with Mother Ascani, so what if I just did the Mother Ascani as the top end of my Batrock stuff instead? More seriously, though, this is a reaction to the ban list, right? This is a demonstration of how context defines what we think of as good. Right now, I would say the Batrock deck is somewhere in 5th or 6th place in the metagame, but if it wasn't getting gambited a million times, and if it wasn't getting outpointed by things like the Captain Carter deck, it would be able to build with a lot more freedom and try to start dictating matchups. Where I do think it's possible Gamer went wrong here is the specific choice of tech cards is very hard call-out-y, which is to say Scarlet Witch is only good against Magic, Luke Cage is only good against Afflict, and if you're making those hard callouts and they aren't rewarded, you might end up thinking maybe I should have taken a more generic or more generically applicable tech card. Low-key, in retrospect, the correct choice for this tournament was probably this Batrock deck, but with Triton instead. That's obviously not something anyone could have known going into it, but it is interesting to note. This is, and that I think, by the way, is a bit of a demonstration of why it's really important to nail those things. And when you do nail them, it is tournament winning, right? Like if they were correct, or if Gamer and Browday, who took this deck, were correct about their assessment of the metagame and got these exactly right, I wouldn't be surprised if they won. But as is, what happened is they just ended up in a bunch of matchups against Cerebro players, and the matchups against Cerebro players with a deck like this, Cerebro player just has more points a lot of the time. And that is just a fundamentally awkward position to be in if your tech isn't really doing anything in those spaces. Extremely similar space from the other person from 3 to 4 player called Khonshu, which is just, here's a bunch of points. I'm playing all this points. I got points on points on points on points. I've got one tech card. It's a Cosmo. The rest of my deck is points. I'm just going to try to out ceiling. And I think that this is a great example of a deck that literally cannot exist because of some of the cards that we banned, because it will never be able to out ceiling a Captain Carter list, and its ceiling gets so totally obliterated by the copying of Gambits. But this is a great example of the stuff I actually kind of expected to see a lot more of in the higher levels here. I think that like some kind of Venus-y maximalist combo deck was definitely on the table here, where it's not technically a combo deck, but the output is such that it is equivalent to a combo deck. Like one of the big things about this tournament was it's very unclear to me. One of my big learnings was I'm not really sure who the second best output deck is after Captain Carter. I just know that Captain Carter is so clear of the competition that it might just be whatever. Cerebro being that in this context was like, oh, that's nice. That's cool. I guess it makes sense. But I'm not necessarily sure that that holds up in a world where all of the bans that we did, including, for example, Isca and Supergiant, are still happening. So I'm interested to know what you think about what you would do, let's say if we just banned Captain Carter and Gambit, because those are the two that I feel are the most impactful, but I think it's impossible to ignore the bans to the others, right? Maybe Batrock wouldn't be nearly as good if we hadn't banned Mercury, for example, and we'd be ending up in a much similar situation to this being the kind of thing that people play, but instead of a Batrock package, it would be more of a package of enters the battlefield kind of stuff. I'm interested. First up, from 5 to 8, another Batrock list, this one from Jacob. And while I do appreciate the initiative shown in just saying, Galactus' first step sucks and I hate him and we'll get him out of here and we'll handle it, I do think that this deck still desperately needs a lane winner, and it's unfortunate that it just doesn't have one. I wonder if maybe it's supposed to be thing first steps or something. I really haven't figured it out yet, but it's definitely the kind of thing where this Professor X is really great if you have another way to win a lane and you don't necessarily have those a lot of the time. A card that I noticed being particularly not good in this list was Viv Vision, who's definitely a card I would consider replacing here. I was also not overwhelmingly impressed with Mary Jane, but part of me does wonder if the correct way to build this deck is not some kind of Professor X Heimdall thing. I'm not sure that necessarily fully holds up, but it is a thought that entered the back of my mind as like, we don't really have a big guy. What if it was just a Heimdall angle and that was the right thing to do? I do know that I disliked Viv Vision greatly in every single instance that I saw her come down, and that Jacob stopped into chat after the end of his run and said, wow, Viv Vision didn't do anything, so I think we have a pretty reasonable consensus on that, at least. Another 5 to 8 here. Jace brought a more open-ended version of a Batrock list here. This is sort of more in line with the kind of thing that I was thinking people would be playing. I gotta say, I can't imagine Stardust was particularly useful, and when you compare having Cosmic Ghost Rider to the ability to play things like Mother Ascani into a gigantic Sasquatch, if you were to ever play those decks against each other, I would strongly suspect that the one that's doing the Sasquatch stuff wins. One of the really important concepts to understand at high-level Marvel Snap is the concept of a pseudo mirror. These decks are very similar between the version we saw Gamer take and the version we saw Jace take, and the similarity is as far as what they're built around, but the differences are what they emphasized outside of that. Gamer emphasized raw power and Jace emphasized tech. And when you have a pseudo mirror, if the tech isn't particularly relevant, the one that's emphasizing the power is going to come out on top, because often tech means sacrificing power in order for matchup specific answers. This is a situation where outside of Mobius, there were not matchup specific answers. So unless Mobius is showing up, the other cards aren't really doing anything. But if Mobius is showing up, then it's curtains for Mr. Sasquatch. And I think choosing the direction you try to go with that is actually like a pretty important thing to think about. This is probably the kind of deck I would have brought, if I'm going to be completely honest. Just a full-on tech slopped up deck, and then I would have probably lost to the guy doing a bunch of points of power in the top 8. One of the coolest things that happened in this tournament is that BuffCap brought a list that is a complete and total pile, but goes to show you how important a couple of specific cards are. The first card is Shadow King. He covers so much. The second card is CGR. He covers so much. And the third card is Spider-Ham. And I think that this is actually a really good example of saying, I don't really know what the metagame is going to be. I'm going to play a bunch of cards that do power. I don't even really care what the power they're doing is. Like, I just have to have something that does power. BuffCap's a big fan of like Ronin mold type stuff. It's just like I care about having things that do things, right? Just some power. We're going to get power somehow on the board. And then we're gonna have these tech cards that are relevant across a wide range of matchups. We have things like Spider-Ham, who I think is one of the most underrated cards in the game right now. There are so many synergy decks that can absolutely lose to this guy, and I love using a one-cost slot on Spider-Ham when I can. There is, of course, also the ability to put a Shadow King under an Invisible Woman. Absolutely phenomenal. Big fan of that. And Cosmic Ghost Rider, perhaps the most generically applicable tech card in the entire game. No complaints here. There is a Ramatut here. I did talk to BuffCap about this. It's pretty clearly just there because he wanted a good 4. I don't know that Ramatut qualifies as good 4, but I understand the drive. Last up, if you asked me to bet on a deck that would get exactly 8th place in any tournament, I would have bet on Phantom X. I love this guy. He's just the world's most, like, in Magic the Gathering, there is a type of deck called Jund. And there was a while, 15 and a half years ago, where Jund was like kind of an actual good deck. Honestly, it's probably closer to 17 years ago. And since then, Jund has become a sort of byword for not just the color combination red, black, and green, but a specific style of mid-range deck that doesn't really run much counter magic and is more about playing a bunch of good cards that have a bunch of 2-for-1 effects and valuing people out of the game, and over time building a sort of incremental advantage, but building an incremental advantage in a sort of aggressive way, I guess you'd say it, sort of archetypally mid-range, but it's also become a byword for mid-range decks that fundamentally don't do enough to stop their opponent from running them over. And I think Phantom X is sort of the Jund of Marvel Snap, where it is doing as much as it possibly can, but somehow still ends up at like an exactly 50% win rate every tournament it goes in. One player does well with it because they understand it on a deeper level. That would be the Reed Duke of this archetype, right? And so you just end up with a deck that is highly reliable at being okay, and good players can make great, right? And that is sort of what I think of Phantom X as right now. Like, this is such a finicky, awkward deck that takes so much work. MSC, the actual name is like MSC and then like a bunch of 1s and 2s, and I don't remember the order, but it is a player that I run into on ladder every so often. I don't know their pronouns, I apologize. And this is a good player playing a solid deck, and I'm not sure if I would say making the deck better, because again, like, I think Phantom X is good, but whenever I watch Phantom X happening in tournaments, I'm like, I understand why this deck is like never really doing as well as I think it should in tournaments, because there's just so many decision nodes in a deck like this, so many ways for you to mess up, so many opportunities for you to blow it. And I think that it's just a very difficult deck to pilot optimally in a sort of reverse way from like the Captain Carter stuff, where the Captain Carter stuff is really difficult to pilot optimally because like sometimes I'll spend a minute thinking about my play and then lock in a play that makes 40 points less than a different play that I had. This deck is the other way. It's like the biggest thing you can learn about playing this deck is to not get ahead of yourself and not overplay your stuff, because your stuff is all so cheap that you kind of do it late, right up until you can't, right? And so like there's this amount of restraint you have to have, and then you can't have it anymore. And I think that dynamic is something people struggle with, and MSC is a really good player, so I'm not surprised to see not struggling with that. Back to the ban list real quick. I want to talk about what I was and wasn't happy with here. I think I was largely pretty happy with Captain Carter getting banned. I think that deck is just a very reasonable ban target. I've got no issues with it. I'm not overly happy with the immediate reaction being, all right, I'll just play the second best all points deck, and that being Cerebro, but I'm not unhappy with it per se. Mercury feels a bit spurious. Like, there was definitely a lot of Batrock running around, and if one of the Cerebro decks had options to deal with the Batrock, but the other Cerebro decks didn't, maybe that would have caused more metagame diversity rather than less. Very happy with the Gambit ban. Get his ass out of here. Not sure how I feel about the Isca ban. I like that there wasn't a lot of multiple man running around, and if I banned Mercury, I felt like I definitely had to hit something for the multiple man deck. And it felt like it would be pretty clown shoes for me to hit something like actually hitting multiple man. Like, come on, that can't be right, right? But the more I think about it, the more I think that hitting Isca meant that there was splash damage on other lists that could have been contesting Cerebro for the points situation that I probably do regret. And I think maybe next time I would have just hit multiple man, even if that made me feel like I was wearing some size 14 clown shoes. Supergiant, I'm very happy with that one. I think that's just a good ban. I'm chilling on it. Like, that deck won the last 2 Golden Gauntlets. I see no reason to keep it around, and it's not like people are going to stop playing Tech Slop because Supergiant's gone. They're still going to be able to do that. Arishem, I think I'd unban next time. Like, that's sort of where my head is at. I think I would unban it next time. I am not overly married to that one, but I think it would be fine if Arishem were running around in this bracket. I don't think it has a shot in hell against basically any of the decks that made the top 8, so I think I'd be chilling on it. I think that's sort of where I'm at on the bans right now. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think about this type of video. I know my viewers tend to be very like, I want good decks for competitive Marvel Snap, and this is kind of a video that's like a little bit adjacent to that. So let me know what you think, and if you enjoyed this kind of video recap of my tournaments. As always, I've been KMBest, you've been phenomenal, and I'll see you in the next one.